With 3.3 right around the corner, Wuthering Waves is approaching a point that a lot of people have been waiting for. We're finally going to see how this whole situation plays out, whether Ahmed can be saved or not, and how the conflict that started back in 3.1 actually continues from here. On top of that, we also have the anniversary coming up, along with the collab, so there's already quite a bit for people to look forward to. With all of that in mind, it's very easy to overlook the second half of 3.2. Going into it, I didn't really expect much either. Not in a negative way, but I wasn't expecting anything major. It felt like the kind of segment that would just tie a few loose ends and move things forward without doing anything particularly impactful. After playing through it though, that wasn't really the case. For what is essentially just a setup for 3.3, this part does a lot more than I expected. We get a clearer look at Denia and the Grand Architect, and even in the short time we spend on that, the dynamic comes across a bit differently than expected, which adds an extra layer to everything that's been building so far. Lucilla is another good example. I didn't go into this with strong expectations for her, but the way she's handled here makes her a lot more interesting than she initially seemed, especially in how she fits into the larger picture. Then there's Hiyuki. Her introduction alone would have been enough to make this segment stand out, considering how much anticipation there already is around her. But what really caught my attention is how she's positioned. It's not just an introduction, it's a setup, very clearly pointing towards something that's going to matter later. That's really the key point here. The entire segment works as that calm before the storm moment, setting things up without overextending itself, while still making sure those setups actually feel meaningful. And for what it's trying to do, it works very well. So there's quite a bit to go through here, even for a short segue like this. At first glance, Lucilla doesn't really stand out as one of the more important or immediately engaging parts of the story. That's not entirely surprising either. Right now, both her and Sigrika are in a bit of an unfortunate position. Sigrika has already been released, Lucilla is about to be, and both of them are sharing that spotlight with two of the most anticipated characters in the game, Denia and Hiyuki. On top of that, you also have the Edge Runner collab coming up, which naturally pulls even more attention away from them. So it's very easy for Lucilla to feel secondary. That was more or less my impression going into this as well. I didn't dislike her, but there wasn't much there that made me particularly interested in her either. That changed pretty quickly after playing through this part of 3.2, and the reason for that ties directly into how the story handles its antagonists. If you've watched my previous videos on Wuthering Waves, you probably know this is one of the areas I've been the most critical about, not because the idea itself is bad, but because of how it's been executed so far. Fractsidus as the main antagonist force aren't inherently a problem. The concept itself works, a shadowy organization operating behind the scenes, always a step ahead, with a larger plan tying everything together. That kind of setup can be very effective. The issue is how it plays out. Up to this point, their role has felt very static. They appear, they have a plan tied to the current region, we get involved, we deal with it, and regardless of the outcome, it's still framed as part of their larger design. Once or twice that structure is fine. Over time though, it starts to feel repetitive. There's no real shift in how that dynamic works, no meaningful pushback, no sense that anyone is actually challenging them in a way that changes the situation. Instead, it often comes down to reacting to whatever they're doing, rather than actively trying to disrupt it. That's where things start to lose some of their impact. What makes Lucilla stand out is that she breaks that pattern. She's the first character who doesn't just recognize what's happening, but actively moves against it. She sees through parts of the Grand Architect's plan, she takes it seriously, and more importantly, she prepares for it. There's intention behind her action, including contingencies for things going wrong, which feels like a very natural response to the kind of threat the story has been presenting. That alone shifts the dynamic. For the first time, it feels like there's actual resistance, something that isn't just reacting to events after they unfold, but trying to interfere with them before they do. Now, whether that will fully change how this conflict plays out is still uncertain. There's always the possibility that everything still ends up fitting into the Grand Architect's plan, which would bring things back to the same issue. That's something we'll have to see once 3.3 continues this thread. Even so, this already feels like a step in the right direction. Since 3.1, the story has been improving in a lot of areas that I previously had issues with. This is one of the last major ones that still needed attention, and Lucilla feels like the point where that change could actually start happening. And even setting that aside for a moment, just on a character level, this is what made her work for me. That shift from being a character I didn't think much about to someone who actively influences the direction of the conflict, it happened pretty quickly, and it completely changed how I see her role in the story. She ended up being a lot more interesting than I expected, and honestly, I'm here for that. Denia is a very particular kind of character. Even without a lot of screen time, she already feels important. As Aleph's one resonator, she's clearly positioned as someone who isn't just relevant now, but someone who's going to matter throughout the entire story. What's interesting is that, despite how little we've actually seen of her, it still feels like we know quite a bit, at the same time, not quite enough. That short appearance in this part of 3.2 ends up doing more than it initially seems to, especially when it comes to her connection with the Grand Architect. Up until now, that relationship mostly existed in the background. You could assume things about it, you could theorize, but nothing was really confirmed. This changes that, and it doesn't really go into the direction I expected. Instead of something more balanced, the dynamic leans pretty clearly in one direction. Denia doesn't come across as someone operating on equal terms, but rather as someone positioned beneath the Grand Architect, with that hierarchy being very noticeable. That's where things start to feel a bit off, not in a way that breaks the scene, but in a way that immediately raises questions. Based on everything the story has established so far, Denia is not supposed to be just any character. As Aleph once resonator, she should be at the very top of the scale in terms of power and importance, so seeing her in that kind of position creates a bit of a disconnect at first. At the same time, it's also what makes the dynamic interesting, because it doesn't feel random. There's clearly something behind it, some kind of reasoning for why this relationship exists in the way it does. The story is setting something up here, even if it's not fully explained yet. The part that still feels a bit lacking though is on the Grand Architect side. As the main antagonist, they're supposed to carry a certain presence, not just in terms of what the story tells you, but in how they actually come across when they're on screen, and while we've definitely seen more of them recently, that presence still doesn't fully land. There's personality there, sure, but the overall impression still feels a bit restrained for someone in that role, which makes this whole interaction land in a slightly unusual place. On one side you have Denia, who is framed as extremely powerful, on the other you have the Grand Architect, who is positioned above her, yet doesn't quite feel as overwhelming as that role would suggest. That gap is noticeable. At the same time, it's also the reason why I'm curious to see where this goes. If the story actually follows through on this and properly explains how this dynamic came to be, it could end up adding a lot more depth to both characters. Right now it feels like we're only seeing the surface of it. Shifting slightly from that, this also ties into Sigrika. Her position here is interesting, mainly because both Denia and the Grand Architect approach her, which immediately puts her in a place where she feels more important than she initially seemed. For the Grand Architect, that interaction is pretty straightforward. It's part of a larger setup, mainly used to draw Lucilla into action, so Sigrika herself isn't really the focus here. Denia's side feels different. There's a more personal angle to it, something that isn't fully explained yet. One way to look at it is through contrast. Sigrika represents a kind of life that stands in opposition to Denia's own situation, which makes that connection feel intentional rather than accidental. Where that goes is still unclear, but there's definitely potential there, especially if Denia's story continues in the direction it seems to be heading. Sigrika could end up playing a meaningful role in how her character develops moving forward, and if that's the case, that dynamic might end up being more important than it looks right now. You can't really talk about this segment without bringing up Hiyuki. At this point, she probably doesn't need much of an introduction. She's easily one of the most anticipated characters in Wuthering Waves right now, and there's already a lot of attention around her even before this. What surprised me is how she's actually introduced. I didn't go into this with strong expectations. There wasn't enough there beforehand to really form a clear idea of what her role would be, so I was mostly just waiting to see how the story would handle her. That introduction ended up being more interesting than I expected, not because of how much we see, but because of how she's positioned. She's very clearly set up as a Chekhov's gun. Now, most people probably know what that means, but just to clarify it briefly, the idea is simple. If something important is introduced early, it's not there by accident, it's there because it will matter later. In this case, Hiyuki doesn't just fit that role, she defines it. This ties back directly into Lucilla as well. Earlier we talked about how Lucilla is one of the first characters actively preparing for the Grand Architect's plan, not just reacting to it. Hiyuki fits into that preparation as the contingency, the piece that only comes into play when everything else fails. That's what makes this setup so interesting, because it immediately raises a bigger question: how far does that actually go? Wish-granting Miko isn't just a title you throw in lightly, it implies a level of ability that goes beyond the usual scale the story has been operating on so far. And if Lucilla is placing that much trust in Hiyuki as a fallback, that suggests her capabilities are meant to cover scenarios where everything else breaks down completely, including the worst case scenario, even something like Aleph 1 descending. At some point, you're no longer dealing with a simple support role, you're dealing with something that potentially reshapes the outcome of the entire conflict. That's where the speculation starts to open up. If Hiyuki is set up this way, then it's very likely that the story is building toward the moment where things don't go as planned, where we fail, where whatever happens in 3.3 doesn't resolve cleanly, and the situation reaches a point where a normal solution isn't enough. That's where Hiyuki comes in. Not necessarily to fix everything outright, but to create an opening, to give the story a way to move forward when it otherwise couldn't. What that looks like, it's still unclear. Wish granting is a very broad concept. It could take many forms. It could be something subtle, something limited, or something much larger in scope. Even something like turning back time isn't completely out of the question depending on how far the story wants to take it. That uncertainty is part of what makes it work. It creates a sense of direction without fully revealing it, and more importantly, it adds tension to what's coming next, because now there's a clear setup that hasn't paid off yet, which means it's going to matter. At some point it has to. That's why Hiyuki stands out here, not just as a character, but as a narrative element. She doesn't just exist within the story, she shapes where the story is likely going, and that makes everything around 3.3 a lot more interesting. Looking at all of this together, what stands out the most isn't any single moment, it's how everything fits. Each piece we talked about, Lucilla shifting the dynamic, Denia's position within the conflict, Sigrika's potential role, and Hiyuki being set up for something bigger, they don't exist in isolation, they all point in the same direction, forward. That's what makes this segment work as well as it does. It understands its role, it doesn't try to resolve anything prematurely, it doesn't push for a payoff that isn't ready yet, and it doesn't overextend itself just to feel important. Instead, it focuses on positioning everything where it needs to be before the story moves into its next phase. That restraint matters. When a story reaches this kind of turning point, the setup becomes just as important as the payoff itself. If the foundation isn't there, the impact of what comes next starts to weaken before it even happens. Here, that foundation feels solid. There's a clear sense that multiple threads are starting to converge. The conflict isn't just continuing, it's building towards something larger, something that's meant to bring together everything that has been set up since 3.1. Whether that payoff actually delivers is still something we'll have to see. That's always the risk. But at the very least, this part does what it needs to do to make that payoff possible. And it does it without feeling like a filler. That's what gives it weight. It really does feel like that calm before the storm moment. Not empty, not slow for the sake of it, but controlled, deliberate, and focused on what's coming next. Now it's just a matter of whether 3.3 can follow through on all of this, because if it does, this setup is going to matter a lot more than it might seem right now. Curious to hear how you see this one, especially since this isn't really the kind of segment that stands out immediately, so I'm interested if it worked the same way for you, or if it just felt like a transition without much going on. Also, with 3.3 right around the corner, I think this is one of those setups that could either pay off really well or just not land at all, depending on how they handle it next. So I'm definitely looking forward to see where it goes. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and subscribe, it helps a lot more than you think. And if you've got a different take on this, especially on Lucilla, Denia, or Hiyuki, I'd be interested to hear it. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.